Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 75, with Jonathan Reidenouer, who is a prolific tutor on the Wyzant platform and elsewhere, tutoring in a whole bunch of different things, but has thousands of hours under his belt, rave reviews, students all over the country, all over the world, and just has really great perspective on the work that he does with students to help them with things like writing and different mathematical concepts and test prep. So just kind of stumbled across him and very grateful to have done so on Twitter. Saw him kind of just sharing out his goals for the year and podcasting kind of factoring into those, and just caught my eye with him tutoring through Wyzant, platform that I've had some experience utilizing as a resource for students, which is just a great platform and on its own. But just really was excited to hear Jonathan's story and just more of what's grabbing his attention. So a lot of good stuff to check out down in the show notes. So please do check all that out and connect with Jonathan as well. But really appreciate him taking out the time. Appreciate you listening to this episode number 75 with Jonathan Reidenouer. And yeah, this is the first guest recording of 2020. So excited to kick off the year here, exploring something that definitely is a different facet of higher education than what I've gone into before. But Jonathan, if you want to kick us off and introduce yourself and kind of give a overview of your professional journey and how you got to be where you are today.
Sure. My name is Jonathan Reidenouer, and I'm 47 years old. I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, attended Susquehanna Township High School. And I'd say that probably initially the first thing I wanted to be was a journalist, especially my junior year of high school. I was really into journalism, wrote for the school newspaper, wrote for the yearbook. And I know that I was interested in journalism. My dad kind of talked me out of it. Not that he didn't want me to be a journalist, but he's a very practical man, still is. Mm-hmm. And so he kind of said, well, you might have to spend years working jobs that are low paying. And I was kind of like, I don't know, maybe I don't want to do that. Early in my senior year, I kind of thought I wanted to be a lawyer, wasn't sure. But then second half of my senior year, a lot of my fellow students started having problems with calculus. And I loved calculus, still do. And so I was able to help them. And a lot of them said, oh, you're really good at explaining this. And I kind of thought, maybe that's something. So when I went to college, was into math education and also mathematics. I ended up graduating with a Bachelor of Science in Math. And initially I started teaching at a school out of undergrad. And this is about 22 years ago. And I wasn't mature enough to handle things. I'll put it at that. A lot of the, 24 years old, I'm still, not exactly a fully developed adult. Was doing some of the same dumb stuff that I did when I was in high school. And I couldn't really keep down a job in the education field. Drifted for a number of years, working mostly in restaurants. I'd worked in restaurants before, and for a long time I worked pretty much in restaurants. Around 2003, kind of came to a, age 31 crisis where I'm like, what am I doing with my life? What's the direction I'm taking? So I boiled it down to two choices. I thought, okay, how about I'm either going to go into law school and become a lawyer, or I'm going to go to graduate school for education. Investigated both of those angles there. Didn't really have much money. My dad, I didn't even ask him. He offered to lend me some money, said I can help you out paying for this stuff. He'd let me know it would be a loan. I'd have to pay him back. After seeing the price of law school, I didn't feel like slapping him with that or me having to pay that off.
Right.
So I went to decide to go to graduate school. Eventually I settled on Liberty University online, and mainly because of the convenience. I mean, I didn't want to be driving to a location, have to stay somewhere or something. And it was in its infancy back then, online education in general. But over a number of years, I worked toward that master's of education degree in secondary ed. And 2011, got my degree after I had done student teaching at a local school here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Finished up my degree and kind of went on a journey of several years where it was a lot of substitute teaching, interspersed with some full-time work with a certain organization in York, Pennsylvania. Worked for one full year at an alternative school, and then later I was called back to the school when they needed some help, and kind of back and forth, just bouncing back and forth there with those things. Substitute taught probably in 20 to 30 schools. I started getting into tutoring a little especially in 2014, but at that time it was still sort of a side thing. But then in the summer of 2015 was when Wyzant launched their online tutoring platform. And in the fall of that year, all of a sudden I started getting all these online students. And by the end of October, I'm just looking at my income and I'm just saying, okay, I'm making, I wasn't raking in tons of money, but I was saying I was making more tutoring than I would as a full-time regular teacher at a school. And I kind of thought, oh, this is interesting. And my wife and I talked about it. And I said, I like doing this. I really enjoy it. I'm going to go all in on this. I'm going to, put aside my other thoughts and plans that I had about, applying at certain schools and trying to go for a teaching job. I said, I'm going to go all in on being a full-time tutor. And so that's what I've been doing since the spring of 2015. So this is the 5th school year now that I've been working as a full-time tutor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's incredible. I guess because the one thing that sticks out is just that's interesting crossroad points where if you're having that realization, like you're saying of wow, I'm making as much tutoring as I could be teaching kind of thing. And if any of the substitute stuff or anything that you're doing was almost getting in the way of tutoring, it just being that sort of just sort of tipping point. And just having to kind of embrace that moment versus pushing back against it. But, well, I guess, I think you, predominantly do tutoring in, sort of mathematical related things, and sort of noting that was a little bit of part of kind of your origin story of you just seem to kind of have a knack for, explaining these in a way for people who are just having a little bit of trouble understanding them. So anything, I guess, just for your own kind of education journey, whether it's in undergrad or master's or just anything maybe that you feel from your kind of, college experience and sort of upbringing, it still kind of resonates with you personally, professionally, it still comes up when you're doing, tutoring sessions and stuff like that. So anything that comes to mind that way of kind of part of your origin story that you feel kind of keeps coming up for you, keeps being useful.
My my 3 main specialties right now as a tutor are math, but also test preparation, like the SAT, the ACT, others, the ASVAB, GRE, GED. And also I do some writing tutoring. I've always been a bit of a, grammar nerd. And I attribute that kind of to a really good, well, 2 things, really good high school education in grammar. As time has gone by, and I understand why it's happened, but as time has gone by, grammar has not been taught as much in high schools anymore. It's more like once you get past 9th grade, you don't get as much instruction in just grammar in the language arts classes. I graduated high school in 1990. Right. I got a lot of that from my teachers. Plus, my mother was she was a teacher, like a kindergarten teacher years ago, but she was always very a proper English person. So that's something that kind of I've even expanded on and studied on and learned more about. And so that's always helped me in dealing with, helping students with writing there. I was always a good technical writer in graduate school as well. So that was always helpful. As far as undergrad school, the most important thing I remember is I got some good math instruction for people. I think of 2 professors in general who really I felt made it interesting and relevant. And that was one of the things that I always wanted to make sure in the future, because too many people, and I understand why, they get this idea that, oh, math is boring or I can't do it. And the thing is, most of the time, they just haven't had it explained to them very well. Or it's been something that a teacher may understand it enough to explain it, but doesn't have necessarily the personality or whatever to make it interesting. So that's something I always wanted to carry over from those 2 professors there. Graduate school, I often joke that in terms of education, I didn't really find graduate school all that helpful for the most part. I found out that I learned more in student teaching than I learned probably in all of my grad school classes. And then once I did a full year of actual teaching, I'm like, whoa, this is intense. I would say there were two things, though. One, there was one really good class in the graduate school about math instruction, about how to teach math. And I distinctly remember it because the textbook was not written like any textbook I'd ever seen written. It was written in a more casual tone, a more practical tone. It didn't have that stilted language that's often textbooks are filled with. And it was readable. And I got a lot of good practical tips on that. That was extremely helpful there. And then just getting some background knowledge. I know I took a course on education, history, and philosophy, and I'm not sure if I have used that in terms of directly. However, just the background, the understanding gives you a deeper knowledge of the path that education has taken in the United States, and even just in my own lifetime, like I can see these trends developing, and having that knowledge of what occurred in the past, it helps you understand better how those trends got to be where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, always appreciate just like having that like contextual understanding of like our current moment. I feel like is always so helpful. But yeah, I mean, I think just like for a professional program like a master's of education focused on teaching and everything, just really having that practical component of it is just so important to apply everything that you're learning through all your courses and everything. But I mean, and obviously all this kind of coalesced to the current moment where I feel like I've seen you share some like impressive metrics in terms of the amount of tutoring that you're doing and everything, and just really kind of, engaging with that really deeply. So, I mean, what really is like, what do you enjoy most about your current work? What keeps you going, keeps you motivated? Because I feel like there's probably a lot to it just in terms of, like the online tutoring side of it. I feel like you do also in-person tutoring and just tutoring on all those different subjects and everything. But like, what do you enjoy most about this work that you're doing now?
A good element of it is the flexibility. And I know that one of the things when my wife and I talked about whether I should, really go full on into trying to be a tutor, was I liked the idea that I was in control of my schedule. Now, you have to be careful though, because sometimes sometimes I can load the schedule up a little too heavy. That happened a couple summers ago where I thought, oh well, I just want to, take on everything that I can, and then it started getting a bit too busy, and there were some times that I didn't have much free time or much time for her at all. But I definitely like the flexibility. I like the fact that I don't have to go to some central location every day for 8 or 9 hours or whatever. That I can go tutor somewhere for an hour, drive to another location, tutor them, maybe come home, a couple hours of free time, then in the evening have some online sessions or whatever. I also like the fact that there's only one layer of accountability, meaning as long as I am explaining things properly and the student is learning, then everyone's happy. I'm doing my job correctly. Something that is always, I shouldn't say always, but has on occasion frustrated me in the field of education, but also when I worked in restaurants, was the whole idea of there being these layers of accountability there. I remember distinctly one school I worked at, I basically had 3 bosses that kind of covered different things. And so you're always wondering, am I doing things right? And I always knew that I had an ability to explain math. I always knew I had a gift to teach math. Of course, in talk about classroom teaching, there's a lot more that goes into classroom teaching than just knowing how to explain a topic. So yeah, I needed help learning those other areas there, understanding things like classroom management and stuff like that. But I always knew how to explain, math or explain topics. So it would always, get me a little frustrated when I had an administrator or anybody else who were like, oh, I don't think you're quite teaching that the right way. I mean, I'll listen to someone's input. Certainly. It's not like I dismiss it and say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I'll listen to their input. But just because that input's been given doesn't necessarily mean it's better than what I've already been doing. I've taken tips from veteran teachers before, experienced people, and said, you know what, that's a good idea. I'm going to incorporate that. I'm never going to turn down a good idea. But just because someone says, I think you need to change, doesn't mean I do need to change. And so that's, in tutoring, that's fantastic because I can explain it And then all I'm doing is looking to see, does the student understand? If the student doesn't understand, maybe I haven't explained it well enough. I need to change the way that I explain it there. But when the student says, it tells me that he or she is understanding, the parents are saying, hey, you're doing a great job. I get feedback. If someone puts a feedback post on my Wyzant page, or sometimes they'll do that on my Facebook tutoring page. It tells me, okay, right there, I've got recognition. I did the right thing. And then it's always probably the greatest thing is when someone contacts me, emails me or calls me and says, hey, so and so gave me your name, said you're a great tutor. Fantastic. That tells me I'm doing my job. I don't have to think that there's this that maybe I am doing my job, but then I get some sort of evaluation that tells me, oh well, here's some things that you're not doing correctly. I'm not a perfect tutor. I continue to try to grow and develop and things like that. I know that I understand how to teach, and this is great because I get the direct accountability from the student. The other thing I'd say is the interaction. I am somewhat of a social person. I'm not a socialite. I'm kind of a mix of an introvert and an extrovert, but I am the kind of person that enjoys the social interaction of teaching. I always felt that one of my biggest strengths when I taught school was being able to build those relationships with the students and build the rapport with the class in general. And one of probably the foundation of that was to treat them as human beings whose opinions and ideas are valued, not as necessarily as children. And obviously they are children, but I'm saying, if a student, for example, one time when I was substitute teaching toward the end of a school year, it was a class where the students really didn't have much to do. And so we were just talking, and this one girl who had known me for a couple of years from substitute teaching, she just says to me, Mr. Reidenouer, are you a feminist? And I said, well, what do you think a feminist is? And then it got us talking about what her ideas were, what her thoughts were, what her angles were, and kind of got into a broader discussion there. But I wanted to hear what she had to say there, and so students pick up on that in that regard. As a tutor, I want to get their knowledge of how they view the class, how they view math in general. I want them to be completely open with me, not put up some false front. One of the things when I meet with a student for the first time is I'll ask them, give me your impression of math. What's your experience in math? How do you feel in math class? Are your questions being answered? Stuff like that. And that way, you build that confidence there. The student will feel comfortable enough to ask questions that he or she might be afraid to ask in class, thinking they'll look stupid. And say, no, at this stage in your life, there's no such thing as a stupid question. You ask whatever you want. If I'm explaining something and you don't understand it, let me know, please, and I will do my best to explain it in another way. And I've been able to build some relationships there where students will feel comfortable enough to just share interesting anecdotes. Sometimes they might say, "Oh, here's something interesting that happened." So I really like that interaction there because it's essential to the core of the tutoring. And as a student, as a teacher, you can't build those with every single student. You can build some good relationships, but that building that element of trust there, I really like that. Because I know that there's a student, there's no hidden things, I should say, where the student acts a certain way in person, and then later I find out that they think I'm a terrible teacher, which has happened to some teachers sometimes. They think they're doing a great job, and they found out later. No, this time it's honest. Everything's open and out there, and I can make adjustments and cater my teaching directly to that student because of that element of trust.
Yeah, it's all really good stuff. Just like building that rapport and being able to do that. And I guess more of a deeper way, or because I feel like it would be difficult if you have a huge class of students and you're just trying to kind of be limited and kind of fit through kind of the cookie cutter model. I think that you were noting where okay, I have to teach in the way that sort of the greater hierarchy of a whole school system wants me to. And I would hope that teachers, would be more able to teach in the way that they want to, kind of thing. But that I think that's maybe becoming less and less so true in K through 12. But yeah, just like so much good stuff. I mean, yeah, just with what you're able to do and working with students, one-on-one and doing it both online and in person, and kind of using, I guess, the best of both worlds, as you can. So no, like, yeah, just like Wyzant as a platform is just really enabling in that way, at least just like having people find you, but then also facilitating sessions and stuff like that.
It's enabled me to tutor students from all over the place as well. I've tutored students from Egypt, Spain, China, Taiwan, India. So yeah, and Russia. This past year, I got hooked up with an organization in New York City that helps Russian students and those who are trying to apply to American universities. And so I've done a lot of online tutoring with Russian students as well. So yeah, it's a great opportunity there.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, then, I mean, I guess if it's anything that is related to just continuing to improve your teaching and tutoring skills, or just like personal fun stuff, I always like to ask, just like, what are you geeking out about right now? If it's stuff, stuff that you've always been into or stuff that you're discovering now, like what's capturing your attention right now?
Yeah, and some of it is certainly things that definitely directly applicable to what I do, and other things, of course, is personal fun. Sports statistics. I'm not into as many sports as what I was as a kid. In fact, as the years have gone by, my interest in certain sports has waned significantly. I have not watched a full baseball game or baseball game actually at all since 2016 World Series. I watched Game 7 when the Cubs won, but I used to, when I was a kid, I used to love baseball. I still like baseball statistics, though. I just don't like watching the game of baseball. For years, when I used to apply to jobs, and I would have to put a resume, or sometimes a resume together, or sometimes just something on the application, I would always say that my hobby was the accumulation, organization, memorization, and analysis of sports statistics. Back in the pre-internet days, I used to really be a stats accumulator. I remember my parents bought me a subscription to USA Today back in 1985 for a year. And so I used to save every week. They used to put out the full sports statistics for the teams during the different seasons. And so at the end of the year, I used to always save the baseball, football, and basketball statistics from the end of the year, and I would have them on file so I could refer to those. My parents used to get me a World Almanac every year. They bought me one when I was 10 years old, and so I eventually discovered a lot of the other cool stuff in the almanac. But I was always like looking in the sports section there, memorizing this. I know the score of every Super Bowl and stuff like that. And now with the internet era and with the launch of explosion of analytics, analytic statistics in sports, now there's like so much more to analyze. And so I love the fact that I'm a member of some discussion groups about the NBA, and so I enjoy the idea that, hey, I can go on to Basketball Reference or go on to some other websites, find these statistics that years ago would be hard to find, and come to an analysis of that. It pays off from a teaching standpoint as well, because the whole idea of just averages, percentages. Last year I was tutoring. I still tutor this kid, but last year I was tutoring this boy in math, 5th grade math, and he's a real sports guy, especially football. And so we were talking about the idea of converting fractions to decimals and percents, and so I decided just brought up straight up real statistics from football. And we talked about completion percentage. We talked about these different things and how to calculate them and apply that, directly there. So that's always been, I've always enjoyed applying that there. I'd say American history and what I call the discovery of the truth, meaning how the reality, or the full breadth of the reality of American history is so much different from what I learned when I was growing up. And as I said, I graduated in 1990, and so an eye-opening book for me was back when I read Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen, where he analyzes 12 U.S. history books, popular history books, and just goes through and compares them to what the truth is, meaning the primary sources that are out there. And you realize, I realized how incomplete some of my education was, and also how some of it was just a flat out lie. Like the idea that Columbus was like trying to prove the Earth was round, which is flat out not true. And yeah, and so that really, since I've read that book, I've been kind of on a personal quest to make sure I know the truth about American history. And so I've had a couple students that I've worked with as being their history teacher in a homeschool format. So they're homeschool students. The parents hire me to work with the student there. And so, during that, I try to bring out more than just the kind of traditional way that it's presented there, because too many textbooks high school textbooks still align themselves with that. I'm very much a broad picture person, so I want to know why things happen, and sometimes coming to that conclusion is not exactly easy or even possible. But the idea of underlying reasons, the interlinking of concepts and complexity of explanations there, knowing that there's one of the things I've said to people is complex problems have complex solutions. If someone is suggesting a simple solution to a complex problem, they're not considering the entire complexity of it there. So I'm always really into understanding that. So like, for example, the whole way that the political parties are becoming increasingly polarized in the United States. Why is that happening? Why is it different? I saw a really great Pew Research thing where it showed these results of these surveys that were given in 1994, 2004, 2014, something like that. But it was spaced out over about 25 years or so, and it was showing how the average position in the two parties, the average center position, used to be so much closer back in the mid 90s than it is now, and now it's much farther apart. Why on earth is that? Well, that's a broad question that requires a lot of things. So I'm kind of like, so that's why when I'm looking at going through social media sometimes, and I'll see different articles, newspapers, online journals, whatever. I'll be like, "Ooh, I think that'll give me a clue, more help." And I like assembling that entire knowledge there. Personally, I'd say the one area that I've always, in terms of entertainment, is I've always been a Star Trek person, and I'm not the kind of person who I would love to go to a convention someday. I never have, but I'm not the kind of person who falls headfirst into the stories and gets wrapped up with continuity or something like that. I enjoy the characters. I enjoy the stories behind it. And I love looking at it in the context of history of television in general. I'd say history of television itself is also something that's always intrigued me. But understanding, what happened behind the scenes, understanding the actors, the decisions, the stuff like that. Yeah, the storylines are fun as well. But my favorite series is Deep Space Nine. But I definitely enjoy kind of the entire ideas of Star Trek, and I've never been someone to isolate myself to just I'm a fan of this particular series and not any others. And also looking at it within the context of American history and history in general, and also the development of technology. It's always fascinating to me to read a story that says, well, let's look at the technology that exists in Star Trek and ask, has it been achieved already? Can it be achieved? And which ones are absolutely impossible to ever achieve using the science we currently have.
Yeah, Star Trek is great. Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those like rich universes. Like stuff like obviously like Star Wars or like Lord of the Rings or like Harry Potter. Just like that's what I love too. Yeah, just like where it has a very firm sense of its whole story and like just a broader sort of landscape and kind of canvas that I can play and like tell all these different stories. Like watched like Star Trek Discovery recently, which is like, you know, the newest series, and just like it's just like a cool another like exploration, classic Star Trek, but like, you know, they keep kind of just continuing to kind of adapt it to the times and everything.
I want to watch that at some point. I will admit I've been stubborn because you got to pay for it on CBS All Access. However, I'm going to cave and pay for that when Picard comes out, because he's Jean-Luc Picard, my favorite character in Star Trek. So I want to see Picard. So, and that's on the 23rd. So I will fork over the money then.
Yeah. Well, that's even the thing too with like any of the now kind of the, you know, kind of all the splintering of all these like streaming services and stuff. I'm just kind of like, yeah, like trying to game it that way. I'm just like, okay, I'm going to get it for like a month or two so I can like watch these shows, and I'll cancel that one, and then I'll like hop over here, you know, because I feel like I'll be doing that with a couple of different things here over like 2020. But yeah, so I could definitely recommend Star Trek Discovery, and I even like, for me, I guess it's, you know, definitely a little bit more into Star Wars. So like I haven't like fully invested in all the Star Wars shows, or the Star Trek shows, but yeah, I feel like I would hope that you know, folks would consider Discovery really in the pantheon of all of them. I think it's very good in its own right. So you'll be in store for a treat there, and yeah, I'm very intrigued to see what they do with Star Trek Picard too. So all good stuff there. Well, I guess it's a good kind of segue and transition here of like other stuff. If you want to kind of just give a particular tip of the hat recommendation of like stuff that we can include in the show notes of other things that you are reading, watching, and or listening to. So yeah, like books, movies, TV shows, podcasts, anything that comes to mind, or video games. I'm not sure if you're into those. Anything that's you know, kind of things in particular that you'd want to recommend. We can link out to those.
I'd say the only video game that ever interested me in my whole life was Tetris. And every once in a while, I still do play Tetris, and that definitely appeals to the mathematical side of me. I know that you know, when it comes to reading, I don't read books too often anymore, and that's not because they don't interest me. I find that as I get older, it needs to be kind of something that really appeals to me. There are some that there's definitely one that I want to read. A friend of mine gave me the Gene Roddenberry's autobiography or biography. But anyway, I was like, oh, that sounds interesting there. I said I love the background knowledge of these things, and I know a little bit about Gene Roddenberry, so I have that book there. I said, because there's such a broad picture thing, I know a really good book I read back in 2008 was called The Narcissism Epidemic, about changes in the United States culture since the 70s that swing to a more self-centered, me first kind of attitude, and just talk about the causes, the landscape, stuff like that. Right, you know, nowadays I love to read articles about things that will fascinate me. So, you know, if I'm on social media, and of course a lot of the pages that I like, so I might see, you know, something written by the New York Times that's kind of a comprehensive report on something. You know, I want to see that, or watching Frontline on PBS. You know, those are things where they dive deep into topics there. Articles about education. Edutopia is a great website and a great source, and I just like reading those articles about kind of the philosophy of education. What are the trends in education? What's going on? What are some tips? Things like that, and just articles about history in general, because I've always been fascinated with history and social science. I don't watch a lot of television other than the NBA. I will watch old episodes of CSI. I've always liked just the concept of CSI. The city of Las Vegas has always intrigued me. I have not been there yet. It's one of my number one on my bucket list, so to speak. There. As far as podcasts go, most of the stuff I listen to are sports related. I like Bill Simmons. One guy who's really smart is Bomani Jones on ESPN. He's got a podcast that comes out twice a week, and he delves into a little more than just sports. And he's got great insight. For just entertainment, I love the Dan Le Batard Show with Stu Gatz on the radio, and also they release it in a podcast there. So that's a lot of times that's from 10 to 1 on Mondays through Fridays. And so when I'm out and about going from tutoring session to tutoring session. That's a lot of times what I have on. Something that, from a historical context, has been interesting is I've started to listen to a bunch of podcasts about the history of professional wrestling. And I'm not into professional wrestling anymore. I haven't watched it in years, but I watched it in the 80s and in the 90s. And I just kind of stumbled across one called 83 Weeks last year. And that led to learning about some others. And so I just find it really interesting to hear people who were in the business, at the highest levels, making the decisions about stuff like that, and getting this knowledge of how they put it together, how these storylines are crafted, interesting things about signing people to contracts and stuff like that. So just the nitty gritty details that I had no idea about, 20 some years ago. And then hearing these people talk about it, then I like that broad insight there. That's always been something that's just incredibly fascinated me. And then the ESPN 30 for 30 documentaries I'm a big documentary fan. So if I see different documentaries, I did not watch the Ken Burns one on country music, although I think someday I might want to watch that. And of course he does these mammoth ones, and they're usually quite rewarding. I did watch the entire one that he did on the national park system because I love national parks, and so I watched that one, and it was I learned just so much from that. But yeah, documentaries I really love getting the knowledge and understanding what's lying underneath things.
Yeah. I was wondering if you were going to mention like ESPN, like sports documentaries and like the history of sports, and because I'm just imagining like just kind of these crisscrossing of interests that happen. Yeah, and like you're saying, like the history of television, like obviously like Star Trek being like huge part of that and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Something that I absolutely have loved are the decade series. So there's two separate ones. So CNN did decade series. They did one in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the first decade of the 2000s. They did one on those. Those were just fabulous. And then National Geographic did a series as well on the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. It's a whole separate one, kind of a different perspective, different angle, different take on it. Those were incredible. And years ago, 15 some years ago, VH1 did a series called I Love the 80s, where they did an hour on each one of the 10 years in the 80s. And then they did another one called I Love the 80s 3D. And they did another one. So they actually did three separate series on the 80s. So it was 30 full hours and that was the decade I grew up in. So I remember back then, I was still using a VCR. I remember recording every single one of those on VHS tape and used to watch those there.
Yeah, that's. I guess and like with wrestling, like in the '80s, it was just like it was like the golden era. I feel like the heyday of wrestling and stuff. Which they're still very active, but I feel like that was like super peak with it, where it's like still people, like all these characters that they talk about.
Yeah, there were two. There was the '80s when Hulk Hogan started becoming the superstar. And then in the mid '90s was probably the wildest one because there were two wrestling organizations. Ted Turner was in control of WCW, and then there was the WWF. And for about 3 or 4 years, they were trying to outdo each other. And so both of them were putting up this quality product. So yeah, that's probably the most interesting thing about the podcast is getting the insight into what was going on during what they used to call the Monday Night Wars, because that was when the two products were going head to head on Monday night and seeing who could get the better ratings.
Yeah. And I feel like, we're just so spoiled now. just generally it was so much good, like content to watch and listen to and all that. But I feel like, cause like somebody there's like a comedian that's making jokes about stuff of like, oh, you'll never guess what they made a documentary about nowadays. And they're like, yeah, you like that joke wouldn't have worked like, 10, 20 years ago, because now it's like, there's so much stuff because like the world and just history is very interesting. So there's a lot of stories to be told. And now like we're in a place where there's so many different platforms and, just more tools to be able to tell these stories. So it's just like anything that you're interested in, there's probably like a dozen documentaries on it, or like a, limited series or whatever, books, all that.
Oh yeah.
And then, what you were talking about with like sports statistics too, it made me think of it. and then just kind of like all the things that you're mentioning of just like with ESPN and like Sports Center and any of these shows, like, and even when you're like watching, live broadcast of any sort of sporting event, they can always pull in these like extraneous sort of correlations of like statistics, and also just kind of say like, yeah, this basketball player like always hits threes from this corner of the court, but never hits them from over here. Or is this much more likely to do this, and just like always interesting when they can frame, oh, if this happens, their team is like this much more likely to win or lose or whatever, like they can just, pull all that information, package it together, whether they're reviewing or doing, live broadcast.
Yeah, the running probability, I chuckle at it. It's legitimate, but it's kind of funny where like if I go on my ESPN app, to check out the score of a game, it always brings up a thing first called the game cast, where it kind of gives a running play-by-play. But then there's always a thing that says probability of winning. And then there's like a graph which shows you a running probability of winning for each team. And so like depending on what happens, you see the one team's probability goes up and then it goes down. And so it tells you at that stage in the game, at every stage in the game, what is the probability of one team winning the game.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, not being really a sophisticated statistician myself, but like I'd have to imagine certain things were like drawing conclusions that aren't actually there, like just in the whole cosmic sense of just sort of like, the numbers game of it all. It's just like, oh, well, if this happens, yeah, like the probability of them winning or losing goes up or down. And it's like, well, I mean, maybe, I don't know if it's like a huge pattern necessarily or enough to really say like, well, absolutely, it's this, this assured that that's going to happen. But yeah, it is a fun game because I guess it is, we have the tools to be able to make a pretty good kind of estimation of these things. And, I think more often than not, then, they are sort of playing out and everything. But yeah, I think it is something that really does like captures people's attention, even if they're not obviously like super deep in like, oh, what's the methodology they're using or whatever. It's just kind of like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I'm just, like shooting percentages or, anything with sports. And I guess just pulling it back to look at you were mentioning before in terms of, kind of breaking down sort of any kind of stress or tension and anxiety people might have with like when you're teaching. It's just like all this stuff that you're interested in and things that you can like pull in, just kind of helping to like disarm people as they might be like really nervous to talk about math for an hour in like a tutoring session. You can be like, well, you know what, let's use examples from, football or something, and maybe that'll help kind of connect the dots and stuff like that. So I feel like it's just such a great way that sort of your point of view and what you kind of consume and really are trying to think about. Obviously, it's just like personally interested and entertaining for you, but like that you are not kind of putting a barrier up of any of that sort of knowledge or anything that any of the experiences that you have. You're bringing all of that in every day when you're having a tutoring session. So definitely, I mean, a lot of kudos for just great nerdy hobbies that I love, but also like bringing that in such a like genuine, helpful way to, really help people out too. So it's all really great stuff. But yeah, we'll wrap up here on the optimistic note that I like to end things on, of something or things that you are looking forward to in your job, life, and or the world. So any one or all of those categories, anything that you're looking forward to.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question because, being aware of changes and trends, I'm like, what is the world, going to look like 10 years from now? And the prediction, like the phase of prediction is going to be too difficult in a certain sense there. But at the same time, there's like, oh, there are things that I am indeed, looking forward to there. I'd say that one of the things that I'm really fascinated about is kind of two things. One, what are going to be the big changes in education over, say, the next 30 years? Now, that'll put me into my 70s. Who knows what I'll be doing by then? But I'm saying I look at that and I think of what are these trends? I know that from following education, I know that there's really starting to be some pushback and demonstrations and speaking up by teachers in different states who are underpaid and overworked, and the whole dumping more and more responsibility on them, but yet schools are states are cutting funding. So what are going to be the trends? I know that I've seen I have there's a certain group of people I know who are, homeschooling kids. And some, obviously it takes money, but some, will hire, tutors to work with them. And I'm wondering will more parents take control of that education there? Tutoring itself has been an occupation that has exploded. Wyzant does some blog posts from time to time, and the CEO wrote one a few months ago, just kind of talking about the difference in trends that they've seen in their organization since it started, and how one of the things they mentioned was that last year over 80% of the tutoring sessions logged on Wyzant were online sessions. And certainly I've seen that progression in my lifetime, and I'm kind of like, from my own standpoint, I'm like, okay, that'd be great if that trend continues there, where more people kind of taking control of their own education, maybe more online courses, ones where I can help students online there. I'm really interested to see how that plays out there, and I'm looking forward to that. Something that struck me that has really been something on my mind recently is I'm sort of convinced that within the next 30 years, maybe, we are going to see a significant reshuffling or restructuring of the political parties. And I think we're going to see something similar to what happened maybe even in the first half of the 19th century, when initially it was the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and then the Federalists dissolved, and then the Democratic Republicans fractured, and then we had the Democrats and the Whigs for about 20 some years, and then the Whigs sort of fell off, and then the Republican Party came about, and so, but even more so, I think, you think of the maybe 1940 to 1980 when basically the parties kept the same names, but there was a reshuffling and a realignment where those who were, Southern Democrats would eventually become Republicans, and some of the more progressive Republicans would become Democrats, and there was this realignment here. And I don't know if it's going to mean that a whole new political party comes about, but I'm looking at that and I'm saying I feel that the entrenched polarization that exists today, I'm like, it can't last forever. I guess I'm thinking like it's got a shelf life, and so I'm thinking that something in the next 30 years is going to happen where maybe one of the political parties has a radical split, and maybe a new party forms and the old one falls away, or maybe there's just going to be kind of a realignment there. I know that with people that I'm associated with, I keep meeting increasingly more people that say, will say like, oh, I'm an independent, or I'm, in the middle, or things like that, and not affiliate themselves specifically with a party. And so when I look at trends, like one of the things I was talking to a student of mine, the one history student I worked with for 2 years, we were looking at, election results. And since 1988, we have not had a president win an election to clear 400 electoral votes. George H.W. Bush did it in 1988. It hasn't happened since. The elections have been closer. And you look back at, say, like Reagan's second election, or when Nixon won in 1972 when he was reelected, or back when I think it was Roosevelt's third term, they cleared 500 electoral votes. Like, they were popular enough that people from the other party were saying like, oh, yeah, this guy is doing a great job, I'm going to vote for him. You can't imagine that happening today. Like, that's just unfathomable that someone could be that popular that people from the other party would be like, oh, let's come over. It seems to be so entrenched there. But I know from being on social media and talking with people that there is a group that is kind of like, an election comes along and they're kind of like, well, I'm not voting along party lines, or I don't believe in all the concepts for this party. So I'm really, when I think of looking forward to stuff, I think of looking forward to things that fascinate me. I guess it's kind of how I look at there. I was even thinking of something involving sports recently, is that I'm wondering if the next 10 to 20 years, 10 years maybe, is going to see a significant change in how football approaches the position of quarterback, and whether it's going to keep looking at it in the same way of this person who has control of the ball, who drops back to pass, things like that, or a team's going to make it a little more flexible, or even get a little innovative and have maybe multiple players on the field at a time who are able to throw the ball. And really mix things up more. I was watching Taysom Hill from the Saints, and how he's a trained quarterback, but he goes out there, he plays some running back, he plays some wide receiver, occasionally he throws passes. Like, what if you had 2 or 3 guys on the field who were that versatile, and think of how you could switch things up? I'm saying that'd be kind of fun to see if that would be an innovation that could take place. So, I'm trying to, at this stage of my life, I'm always trying to look at the trends and see, what's going to happen down the road. Hey, I'm not Nostradamus, though. Of course, he wasn't perfect either. But I'm saying, I look at the future there, and I wonder, what's going to happen, predicting things, and sometimes things come out, a lot different than what you expected.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that kind of is like tethering a lot of the sort of looking forward to a lot of what we talked about in terms of education. And I mean, I work remotely. I work in sort of the online education space for higher ed, and just seeing like day to day, just more, kind of expansion of that, which just allows more people to get a high quality digital education, wherever you are, wherever they are, like you did. And then, just with things like, with the sports, it's just like, like getting away from just like the limiting idea of what a quarterback is. And like, just, that would just be, I think, more interesting for the game. And in terms of just like, like American political life, just hoping that like this very furious boiling that's been happening in division and all that, just hopefully that settles down, so that we can get to being a place where it just doesn't feel so like there's so much friction all the time, and just hard to like get things done. It'll be interesting to see. Because that's just like, I just turned 30, so like you kept kind of using that like benchmark where it's just like, I mean, that's been like my whole life, but I mean, I'll probably be around for another 30 years, so who knows what'll happen. But like feeling like so much has happened in the past 30 years, like, I mean, I don't know, like what's 30 years from now gonna look like. So and I guess also very appropriate as we start a new decade and all that, just kind of thinking in those ways, and what can be and what will be. But I mean, I appreciate you so much for jumping on here and sharing all that you did, and we'll have ways to connect with you and all that you talked about down in the show notes for the episode. But just thanks so much for your time, and for hanging out for a little bit here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This podcast is part of the ConnectEDU Podcast Network, bringing together diverse voices in the higher ed community. Check us out on Twitter at ConnectEDUPod or at connectedu.network. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast.